Hi everyone, this is Dr. Young. I'm doing this video as an introduction to History 362 Pre-Modern Africa. I wish that we had been able to meet for the first class and go over this face-to-face more thoroughly, but as this hurricane has prevented that, we have to improvise here. So I'm mostly just going to go over the syllabus, talk about some ways to tackle this course, go over requirements and things. If you have questions, please post them on the course logistics discussion board. You're welcome to email me directly if the questions are, perhaps germane only to you, but if they are general to the class, please post them on that discussion board because other people may have the same questions. You can note our class meeting time and place and all of that. Please note my office hours here and everything so you know when to reach me. I am on campus more often than that. I do tend to keep my door closed because I'm pretty introverted and I work best in solitude, as it were. And so you are definitely welcome to knock on my door if you see that it's closed. If you're trying to find me, feel free to do that. Of course, you can email me. That's my main form of communication with students, the official form of communication. So please, if you need to reach me, do that. You're welcome to drop by my office and knock, and hopefully we can meet up at a time that's convenient for both you and me. The course description for this is that this course examines the studies and cultures of the African continent from ancient times through the period of the transatlantic slave trade, roughly to the end of the 18th century. But we will be looking back actually very early in African history. And so this course covers a really big chronological expanse, almost too big, one might say. But like with most upper division courses, we will examine a number of topics. As it says here in the description, topics of study include oral tradition, political and social organization, migration, religion, and slavery, all of which are highly relevant to the study of African history. And there are a few problems with this description, even though I wrote it some years ago. We should mention that Africa is a vast continent. If we had been able to have an introductory class, I would have pulled up maps of Africa and compared it with other regions of the world. Suffice it to say that you could fit, all of Europe, all of the United States, Canada, or let's see, I got to think about this. Anyway, Europe, the United States, China, India, and a few other places into the continent of Africa very comfortably and still have room left over. It's a huge continent, second largest in the world. And so, understandably, the history of Africa is varied. To say African history is inherently problematic because really we have to look at different regions of the continent to even begin to form coherent histories, right? The history of Northern Africa is vastly different from the history of East Africa or West Africa or Southern Africa. Even though there are some contacts between the different regions, for the most part we have to look at these kind of pockets of civilization in these different places. And there are other problems with studying African history that I'll get into a little bit as we look at the learning outcomes here. So hopefully some of you may have taken another African history class from me, maybe my introduction to African history course, which would give you a leg up, so to speak. But this course will focus very intently on a number of themes, right? And so even if you don't have previous exposure to African history, I have some things built in that will help you catch up and form a knowledge base early in the semester that will help you as we go through this whole semester. So, under expected student learning outcomes here, I did that. Okay, so sorry about the notification. Historians since the colonial era have assumed that Africa had little or no history of note before the arrival of Europeans in the 18th and 19th centuries. And a quote that I like to trot out for students as I'm introducing African history is by a famous British historian named Hugh Trevor Roper. And this was actually part of a radio interview he gave, I think, in the early 1960s with BBC Radio or something like that, where he said it's, a lot of people are becoming interested in Africa, but that's really kind of foolhardy because at present Africa has no history. There may be at some time in the future we may have an African history to talk about, but presently Africa has no history. There is only the history of the presence of Europeans in Africa. And then he went on to say, and I'm trying to quote here, the study of Africa is little more than the unrewarding gyrations of primitive peoples in picturesque but irrelevant corners of the globe. And I think that that's a direct quote. Now, I think we can all see perhaps the problems with that quote, but we might ask, what does Hugh Trevor Roper mean by Africa has no history? And what he really means there is that Africa does not have the kind of history, at least much of it, is not the kind of history that European-style professional historians, and that would include Americans who are, kind of in the wake of the discipline of history, which was formulated in the 19th century, first in Germany and then in other parts of the West, which looks primarily at written evidence to do history. In other words, historians spend their time in the archives, unearthing documents, which they then use to interpret the past. Really, it's difficult to do that kind of history in Africa. It is possible. It's more possible than Hugh Trevor Roper would give it credit for, because there were some very literate parts of Africa, some literate centers. You have to be able to read Arabic to do that history, for the most part. But, it is not without archival type history. But for the most part, most regions of Africa were not literate. That doesn't mean they were uneducated. It doesn't mean they didn't have very effective means of communication, of keeping track of the past, of telling stories about their societies, about great figures in their societies, about the distant past to their contemporary age. They had all these things. They just didn't do it in written form, right? And so, as I note here, okay. The problems of pre-modern African history are indeed vexing. In addition to a total lack of written sources, and I shouldn't say total lack there. It's not, there, as I said, there were literate centers, but a near complete lack of written sources. African societies left behind few extant material remains, and so even the techniques, the methodologies of archaeologists cannot always be brought to bear in the study of African history, though. Again, there are more there than perhaps this description notes. As a result, the distant African past must be reconstructed in other ways. So a big part of the challenge of this course, and correspondingly one of the important desired learning outcomes, is learning how to do history without consulting the kinds of materials historians normally use to reconstruct the past. You need to open your minds, your imaginations, your horizons as students of history to study the ancient and medieval periods of African history, at least for most of the continent. Okay, and we will talk at length about what all of that means, about how it's possible to do that, and so forth and so on. So that is one of the learning outcomes here, to learn that you don't necessarily need written documents or a plethora of written documents in order to do history, right? That there are other means, other ways of doing this, and historians who have formulated some of these ways of doing that are incredibly creative and certainly worth our attention. And the African past, which relied on oral tradition and which was highly mobile and thus left behind few extant material remains, is still a very interesting past, one that is worthy of our attention, one that we ought to be interested in, one that is totally valid as a subject of study. And so Hugh Trevor Roper, to the contrary, Africa does have a history, a very rich history, but it's one that requires historians to be very creative in pursuing. So with all of that in mind, students should expect to obtain the following knowledge and skills in this course. Number one, bullet point one, an understanding, untainted by ethnocentrism and progressivism, of the major trends and themes of pre-modern African history. And what I mean by the ethnocentrism and progressivism is that it's very difficult to approach African history. I would say impossible to approach African history in productive ways if we believe that Africa is primitive, that it was home to people who were less advanced, who really needed to be sort of trained and brought into civilization by Europeans. In other words, if we hold these colonial attitudes in mind and approach African history that way, then we are going to run into trouble. We're never going to be able to encounter the African past in ways that will teach us anything valuable. Okay, and this was long how historians, especially Western-trained historians, approached Africa as a place that really wasn't worthy of study because the people there didn't produce anything of note, anything that was really relevant to the kind of emerging global world in the 19th and 20th centuries during the colonial era, and that Africa was really just irrelevant to the study of history. Well, I think nothing could be further from the truth, especially with the growth of population in Africa and the growing importance of Africa in the kind of geopolitical scheme of things and the global economy, and all of the potential that Africa has. It's really important that we look back at the African past and have some sense of where the different peoples, the different regions of Africa came from, and how that has influenced the way that they operate now, right? As is the case for any society, any civilization in the world. So we need to get rid of those ideas and approach Africa on its own terms, right? We can be helped, the second sentence here, for the more comprehension of how those trends have been interpreted by modern historians. We can really be helped by those who have reconstructed the African past carefully. I have assigned some monographs in this class, as well as the watching of a film, which I think is a really valuable exercise, especially for the topic that we'll be looking at that time, because I really admire historians who work on pre-modern African history. I have some experience in this really as a kind of secondary field. This was a minor PhD field for me. It's something that I have taught for many years and been very interested in, and have really been inspired by the historians who have really figured out how to do the history of Africa, how to tell these stories in ways that are just incredibly creative and interesting. So hopefully you will not only comprehend how the past has been interpreted by historians, but also appreciate the creativity that has gone into that. Speaking of that creativity, second bullet point here, the ability to engage and interpret both primary sources from and secondary sources about pre-modern Africa in original ways. And some of that will be learning how other historians have done this, and some of it will be sort of making choices about how you want to take a look at the sources. And of course I've assigned some primary sources in this class and asked you to write papers about them, and so you need to bring your own interpretive lens to those sources. As noted, the source material of the distant African past is different from that of most other civilizations, but it is not without value, certainly for a student of history. And then finally, as hopefully with all history classes, enhance critical thinking, reading, writing, and oral presentation skills. And you will have ample opportunity to do all of those things, to grow your abilities in all of those areas. The required text, Number one is Christopher Ehret's textbook called The Civilizations of Africa, History to 1800. This is one of only very few textbooks out there on pre-modern African history. I should note that Christopher Ehret, who I think he's certainly retired at this point. I don't know if he is in fact still alive, but he was one of the groundbreaking historians, going all the way back to the 1960s or possibly even earlier than that. Groundbreaking historians of the distant African past. He spent most of his career, I believe, at UCLA. And the other one, interestingly, who fits this category is Jan van Sina, who spent most of his career at the University of Wisconsin. And a little sort of tidbit here, kind of inside baseball stuff related to historiography. Christopher Ehret and Jan van Sina could not stand each other. Even though they used very much the same kind of methodology, they were sort of co-pioneers in the methodology that we call historical linguistics or glutochronology, which we will spend plenty of time talking about what that is later on in the course. But van Sina and Ehret, I think it's sort of like Newton and Leibniz, or Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla. Who figured this out first? Who was better at it? Who was the greater innovator? Right. This is one of these instances in historical circles where two really brilliant historians ended up not liking each other very much and kind of being rivals. So that sort of thickens the plot, as it were. And we're going to read, something from both of them. I really admire both of these scholars. So that one, you will have frequent readings in the textbook. You need to treat it as a textbook, okay? That is, as a kind of tertiary source, one that takes a synthesis of a lot of things that are written on the topics. Ehret does put his own personal spin on things. And as I said, he was one of the... seems like whenever I make these videos, I yawn a lot, so my apologies for that. But Ehret was, a definite innovator in the field and somebody that we should respect for his contributions. In addition to that, there's a kind of supplement to the textbook, which is this book called Problems in African History, the Pre-Colonial Centuries, edited by Robert O. Collins, and I think there's actually a second editor now. I believe I have this pulled up here. Ruth Ayab. Yeah, I should have put her down as well. Anyway, this is the Problems in African History book. I have it pulled up here on Amazon because I want to look in a minute here at the table of contents as we look at the daily schedule, so I can explain something with that. But in any case, that's the second book you need to obtain. Now, I have three, we can call these primary sources. Two are written primary sources, or one of them is actually oral traditions that are collected and written down. Two of them actually fit that description. The other is a book on art and architecture in Africa. So first of these, Ditinyane Sundiata, an Epic of Old Mali. If you have taken my Introduction to Africa class, you will have already read this and written about it. That's good. You're going to write another paper on this, okay? Hopefully going in a different direction than you went on that paper. But Sundiata is a story. It was an oral tradition for many centuries. It was written down perhaps about 100 years ago, and actually has been written down in different forms. But it's about events that took place in the 13th century. The formation of the kingdom or the empire of Mali, the founding father, the founder of that empire, whose name was Sundiata. And it's a fantastic story. It's a really great story. It's one of my favorite things, in fact, to read with students. It's not very long either. It's only about 80 pages, so it won't be overly onerous for us, but something that we definitely should pay attention to and be aware of. And then a book, and this is a Penguin Classics text, called African Myths of Origin. This will be something that will get us into the culture of societies all around the African continent. Myths of origin are potent in almost any civilization, things that account for how the civilization came to be, even how the world came to be in some cases. And scholars have collected these myths of origin from all over the African continent, and we will use them to examine the values, the attitudes, and so forth and so on of different African societies. And then finally, a book on art and architecture in early Africa, edited by Peter Garlake. And so we will take a look at that theme. Some really important works of art and architecture were produced in pre-modern Africa, ones that we will want to be aware of and analyze. And then 3 monographs: Jan van Siena's How Societies Are Born, Governance in West Central Africa Before 1600. Like I said, van Siena, along with Ehret, was one of the kind of groundbreaking scholars in the use of historical linguistics. Again, something I will discuss later on. Actually, sooner than later, we should say. But this is one of van Siena's monographs. I think it might have been the last one that he wrote before he retired. But it is a wonderful monograph, one that really leaves you admiring van Siena's methodologies. At least that's the case for me. I suppose that doesn't have to be the case for you. Second monograph, John Thornton's The Congolese St. Anthony. This is kind of a micro-history, actually, about events that took place in the 16th century in the region of the Congo, shortly after the Portuguese got there and Christianized, or at least converted many of the inhabitants of that region to Christianity. And it's also bound up in some ways with the slave trade. And then a third monograph, David Northrop's Africa's Discovery of Europe. This is something I only came across recently, and something I'm excited to share with my students in this class, and talk about kind of a different perspective on the interaction, the early interaction at least, between Europeans and Africans. There are other assignments, some of these online that are on web pages, others that I will distribute in PDF. I actually, given that campus is closed currently, have not been able to make it to my office to make scans of some of the relevant files. I will try to get that done sooner than later, but we may have to adjust depending on what we're able to access and what this storm ends up doing. Now, the thing that every student, of course, wants to know is, what do I have to do for a grade in this class? This is an upper division class, okay? So there's going to be a lot of reading, a lot of writing, and some other things that I think are necessary to help us have a knowledge base to encounter Africa. And the first of these is that you need to take a geography quiz, okay? And this is going to come soon, right? So we are not able to have our first meeting. I'm actually filming this, as you can see, during the time we would have been meeting if this hurricane hadn't happened. I was going to try to get this done earlier, but I've been trying to prep my own house for this. Anyway, and so the first take of the geography quiz is going to be in the first meeting of the course. I hate to put that kind of pressure on you. Actually, I don't hate to put that kind of pressure on you. This is something that's necessary. You've got to know some African geography, okay? Now, how to study for this quiz? Well, at the very end of the syllabus here, and I'll go over this other stuff later, you'll see that I have a study sheet, right? The modern nations of Africa are not necessarily relevant to the pre-modern context that we're going to be talking about. The boundaries there were created largely in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But I will be saying things like, this is in modern-day Zimbabwe, or modern-day Western Congo, or something like that, right? And so you need to know where these places are. And rather than give you kind of a region-by-region quiz here, I thought, the most relevant thing, or the easiest thing to do would just be to ask you to memorize where all of the nations of Africa are. A number of cities here. Some of these are pre-modern, some of them not necessarily, but anyway, I just want you to know kind of some of the major cities in Africa. Maybe most important for the periods we'll be discussing are the bodies of water, because as with pretty much every area of the world, much of human habitation ended up along rivers or by lakes, or anyway by fresh water supplies, and so it's important that we know all of these bodies of water. And make sure, for instance, that you know which branch of the Nile is the white, that is the western one in the southern part of the river, and which one is the blue, that's the eastern one that comes out of the Ethiopian Highlands. Of course, for that you have to know where the Ethiopian Highlands are, right? Then we have a few mountain ranges on the continent that I want you to know about, and then some other features. The Great Rift Valley, for instance, the Cape of Good Hope, a few deserts, a region called the Sahel. You need to be conversant in all of these geographic terms to understand Africa. So, this will help you obtain that vocabulary, as it were. So, at the beginning of class, well, maybe not quite the beginning, anyway, at some point during our class on September the 9th, I will give this geography quiz, so you need to study for that. How to do this? Well, I might recommend something like this, okay? Let's see. So, type in like blank Africa map with rivers into a Google search here, okay? And look, this pulls up, a map here, right? This one can even give you all of the rivers, okay? And I will mention that in this quiz, I have just pulled probably some of these maps. This map right here is one of the ones I use for the quiz, okay? So if you mark where all those rivers and you know where they all are, and then the other bodies of water, right, surround it, you should do just fine. And then maybe, blank Africa map. This is one that can help you do the nations of Africa, and then you could put little dots for the cities. Kinshasa's over here, and Johannesburg and Pretoria are down here, and so forth and so on. Anyway, I would just print out some of these maps, or put them in a form that you can write on them. If you have a tablet or something in a stylus, you can do it that way, I guess. But start to fill these things in and study from that. Okay. Just a suggestion. Maybe you have another way you can learn geography that isn't that, but that's I think a good suggestion. Second, there is a grade for class participation. If you miss, and I'm going to edit this on the fly because, sorry, I thought I had gone through and fixed all of the problems with the syllabus, but I guess not. This class only meets once a week. And so we have an entire week's worth of course in this if you miss more than one class. Now, the class that was supposed to meet today does not count, obviously, because none of us are there, right? But if you miss more than one class, you will start to lose points on participation. Now, this is more than just an attendance grade, though. I expect you to, as I say here, come to class, make comments, ask questions, and otherwise be engaged in the learning process to do well in this, okay? A little bit more about attendance here in a couple of minutes. Anyway, another requirement, or an oral presentation. So I mentioned that there is this book edited by Collins and Ayab called Problems in African History. Okay, this book consists of articles on some historical problems, meaning things about which there is debate, things about which there isn't a kind of definitive answer, right? One of these is the place of ancient Egypt in African history. And Egypt is part of the African continent, even though ancient Egypt has sort of been claimed by the West as an important precursor to Western civilization. And so there's some really kind of profound debates that have gone on over the place of Egypt in history, and that's, one of the things that we want to discuss here. So when it comes time to cover this, if we go back to the syllabus, let's see, it's in Word, okay, and look at, look at the daily schedule, you'll see down here under September 16th, so 2 weeks from now, Collins Problem 1. When we meet on the 9th, I will essentially assign students to give presentations on specific articles in the Collins IOB Problems in African History book. Right? So say you were assigned to present on, and I might give you, if the article is longer, then I would probably only give you one of them to present on. But if it's a little shorter than that, I might give you two. Like some of them just go together. You've got this article by Cheikh Anta Diop, one of the kind of founding members of the Afrocentric school of history. And then there's this review of Diop here, right? I might assign a student to teach the class about both of those. In other words, to take charge of the class, to talk about the articles, come up with questions to ask the other students. Really what this presentation is for 15 to 20 minutes, you need to teach the rest of the class about that article and lead a discussion about that article, okay? And you're graded on that, right? So I'm essentially asking each of you to teach the class about your assigned article or group of articles. There won't be more than two assigned to any one student. Now this might necessitate, doing some background work. It would be important if you're assigned to give the presentation on Cheikh Anta Diop to have some sense of who that guy was, right? Because that's more relevant for some of these writers of the articles than it is for others, but you certainly would want to know who Diop was and kind of the trajectory of his career and everything like that, because it's relevant to the discussion. Okay. And I will field questions about this in the discussion board and maybe in the first time we actually are able to meet physically. There will be 3 book reviews for this course, 3 monographs, Vancina, Northrop, and Thornton. And then there will be a film. The film is called, and this is actually the very end of the course, you'll see here in December. We're going to watch the film Adangaman. Since this class is 2.5 hours long, we'll be able to do that without problem. I think that film is around 2 hours, maybe a little less than 2 hours. This is a film made by African filmmakers using entirely African cast. There is not a single European person, in fact, in that film. It is about the slave trade, but it's about the slave trade in the interior of Africa before the human chattel made it to the coast and were sold and crammed into a slave ship and sent across the Middle Passage. Okay, so it's I think a really interesting look at the slave trade, and so you'll need to write a review about that. Now, for book reviews and film reviews, here at the end of the syllabus, I have given you a set of guidelines on writing a book review, as well as a set of guidelines on writing a film review, right? So you will want to peruse those, take a look at them. If you have questions about what's required there, we can talk about it in class. You can post it to the discussion board, but I will have a lot to say about how to do these things. The reviews should be 3 to 5 pages. This is actually a little shorter than what I usually assign, but this class has a lot of writing assignments, and so I wanted to sort of keep it down. I think you can write a decent review in 3 to 5 pages for sure. Primary source explorations. So you need to write 3 of these. I mentioned that there are 3 larger primary sources we're going to be looking at. You got Sunjata, the Myths of Origin, and then the Art and Architecture. Okay, you need to choose which of these to write the 2 short papers and which to write the 1 long paper on. You can choose, okay? You can decide to knock it out. The first one we'll look at is Sunjata. You might want to decide to knock this out at the beginning. Write your longer paper and save the shorter ones, for later in the semester. Actually, the Art and Architecture might be first, come to think of it. I need to look at the daily schedule. Anyway, but 2 of these papers will be 3 to 5 pages. 1 will be 6 to 8 pages. Really, that's just a matter of framing and coming up with a research question or a historical question that enables you to to write less or write more, right? To cover that topic in fewer pages or longer pages. I personally think that writing a 6 to 8 page paper is probably easier than writing a 3 to 5 page paper, because you really have to limit your scope of inquiry to do a 3 to 5 page paper. But you may not share that opinion. I don't know. I have given you, and I will talk about this a great deal in class, but I have given you here in the syllabus a set of primary source analysis suggestions as well, right? And so you might take a look at those and as you prepare to write those assignments. Okay. So some papers, and then there will be a final exam that will consist of 2 long essay questions. The exam is on, and I had some wiggle room here since we meet once a week. I could have scheduled it for the Monday, December 9th, but I decided, since it was ambiguous, to schedule it for December 11th, 5 to 7 p.m. Okay, so this is the Wednesday of finals week. I'll give you a little more time to study. Of course, you probably have other exams. Not probably, almost certainly have other exams. So those are the course requirements. I did mention, I think, that each of the short papers are worth 25 points, the longer paper is worth 50 points. So that long paper is worth the same amount as the final exam, right? So take those things very seriously. There are 350 points possible in the class. There's the grading scale, looking at the number of points you need to get the specific grades. And you can read through this stuff on, the way that I see this class. For the most part, and I would draw your attention to this, the main activity of the class is close reading, critical analysis, in-depth discussion of primary and secondary source texts, right? This is very much a discussion-based class. Because it's topical, for the most part. It's tough to go chronologically, except in sort of broadest terms, through African history. You really dive into a lot of topical stuff. The term that I like to use is post-holing, right? You stop at some point and you dig a post hole. You dig deep down into something and look at it in a number of different ways, and then you sort of move on to the next post hole down the line a little bit. That's really the structure of this course. Okay. Attendance policy. Okay. If you get perfect attendance, I will automatically give you 4 extra credit points. If you miss 2 classes or more classes, you will begin to have some deduction to your grade, right? 3 points to your participation grade. For every class you miss over 1, you simply have to be in class. If you incur 5 absences, you're missing 5 weeks of a 14-week course at that point, I will simply withdraw you from the class. Okay, so be aware of my attendance policy there. Academic honesty. This should be familiar to all of you. Do not cheat. Do not plagiarize. All your written assignments will be submitted actually to Canvas, which will in turn submit everything to Turnitin.com. So that is one line of defense. I have others that I will keep close to my own chest, as it were, right? But I am really good at catching plagiarism and things like that. So don't do it. I actually have a fairly liberal late policy, a grade deduction, but I accept late papers with some grade deductions. So please, it's good to turn things in, right? But it's better to turn something in late than to get no credit for it at all. Here's the disability statements. Here are all of the ways of acknowledging your disability and arranging for accommodations, and I'm definitely willing to make all those accommodations. Title IX, very important stuff there. Okay, and along with that, right, this is my classroom is a safe space. I intend to present materials in ways that do not discriminate, exclude, judge, or demean any person's beliefs, values, or lifestyles. And I expect all students to do the same thing. So hopefully that is not a problem for anyone here, and we can, be all feel safe in the classroom. That doesn't mean we won't necessarily get into, topics that might be somewhat controversial, right? I hope that we can do that in a very mature fashion and, be conversant in these things and make sure, at the same time, that we respect everyone. Okay, so let's look at the daily schedule here just a little bit at the end. So note that I have distributed the geography quiz study sheet to you, right? I have done all of these things. I haven't gotten into the methodologies as much as I would like, but I'd rather save that for face-to-face discussion. For next time, and this is, I think, the longest reading assignment of the entire term, and since you are all stuck waiting for the hurricane to pass at this point, you have lots of time. Hopefully all of your other professors have given you a break because I am not here. Okay, you need to read chapter 1 through 3 of Eret. That is the textbook. You need to read the first couple of chapters of Garlic. That's the art and architecture book. Definitely look at the images. You may be able to skim some of the material, but you need to be conversant in it. And then I have not been able to do this because campus is closed, but there are a couple of articles, and I need to dig in my files. I may have made electronic versions of these before. I can't remember whether I gave out paper copies or what, but anyway, there will be a couple of shorter, these are not terribly long articles, from another book that I've assigned to students in the past but decided not to do it, but I still want to include those. Okay, so actually quite a bit of reading for this first time. We will do the geography quiz for September 9th, but you need to have read all of this before you come to class on September the 9th. Okay, and be ready to discuss it. And we will talk on the 9th about assigning the articles in the Collins IOB book. You'll see that the first problem is the 16th. Problem number 2, I think, doesn't come until the 21st of October, right? So we've got the Egypt one early, and then we don't get into others until somewhat later. So there are a few other sources like the Ibn Battuta here and these different articles and things that you will be assigned. So edit some more here on the fly while I'm teaching. In any case, now one thing I will have you note is that we really don't have any writing assignments until about a month into the course. Okay, you've got the geography quiz take 1 on the 9th and then take 2 on the 16th. Note, I don't think I mentioned this, the geography quiz, take it twice. I mean, unless you get a perfect score on the first one, there is no penalty for taking it a second time. You simply keep the higher of your 2 scores, right? So I will give it twice. There will be 50 questions on each of these, and each one worth a half point, okay? So be prepared for that, right? There is no word bank, by the way. You don't get to take the study sheet with you into the quiz, okay? You need to simply know these things. So this does put some pressure on you, but start preparing for that quiz. There will be some of these student-led class discussions. This is your oral presentation on the 16th, but the writing assignments don't come until, the first one is due October the 9th, right? But then they sort of come fast and furious. Pretty much every week that we meet, you will have. So we meet on Monday, every Wednesday, this is how I've baked it into the course, you will have a writing assignment due. Now we won't have class on the 14th of October because that's the fall break. But we will on the, You have an assignment due on the 9th, you have one due on the 23rd, you have one due on the 30th, you have one due on November 6th and 13th and 20th, and you have your last one due on December 6th. So pretty much from the beginning of October to the end, you've only got a couple of breaks there where you do not have a paper due. So you need to just get accustomed to be prepared to write on a frequent basis in this class, and you should do well. Okay. Again, if you have questions about the course, anything, please post them to the course logistics discussion board, and otherwise start reading. And I look forward to seeing you in class. Hopefully, again, the hurricane does not do a tremendous amount of damage to any part of Florida. Unfortunately, the Bahamas seem to have been hit very hard by this, and I think we all need to be thoughtful and mindful of the people who are suffering there. On that note, that very downer note, stay safe, stay dry, and I will see you in class. Thank you.